So we've talked a little bit about this idea of conflict resulting from some sort of cost-benefit calculation where people are fighting over something that's maybe material. But a large number of conflicts, particularly today in the international system, tie into some element of identity. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about ways in which identity can foster conflict, both in terms of within states, sort of civil wars, and also between states, where states are engaged in irredentism, right? Desiring the territory of a neighboring state and seeking to redraw those borders between states. So a little bit in terms of definitions, we have this idea of an ethnic group. This is a group of people where there's a common ancestry, maybe oftentimes it's some sort of imagined common ancestry, or historical experience, or a cultural similarity, whether that's language or the fact that German children had Grimm's fairy tales read to them, and that experience of being traumatized by these fairy tales produced sort of a common sense of German identity, right? So we have this idea of an ethnic group, right, where there's this common element, but then there's also a feeling of community by those people, that they look at that common element and say, yes, that's what makes us connected in terms of this group, right? So it's not something where an outsider can look at a group of people and say, oh, well, they're all the same, they speak the same language, or they all have the same religion. It doesn't work that way. There has to be that sense of community internal to the group where they identify it. A second related concept, because it can be an extension of ethnic identity, but it doesn't have to be, is the idea of a nation, right? And a nation is a group of people that have a common identity. It could be an ethnic identity, but it could also be, as in the United States, an identity based on an ideal or an idea, right? The United States American identity is rooted in a commitment to the Constitution, right? And the experience of sort of the new world, that sort of forges the unique character of American identity, and that's the foundation for that national identity. So there's that common identity, but then there's also a desire for political voice. It goes from simply saying, yes, this is my group and I recognize people as part of my group, to saying, yes, this is my group and our group should have a political voice. Our group should be able to control our political destiny and make sure that we have a say in our future, right? And so once we have this idea of nationalism, then we have to figure out what to do with that. How do we accommodate that? How do we work that through? And self-determination is the principle that we should realize this idea of national identity and the desire for political voice and control through the creation of nation states, that we should get the borders of states to line up pretty closely with the population in a nation, so that there's that connect, so that desire for your group to have political voice can be realized to the fullest extent. This is something that Woodrow Wilson was sort of pushing with his 14 points. 6 or 7 or 8 of those 14 points relate to the idea of drawing the borders in such a way where we're going to put people together that might have that common identity, that's going to be much more stable than multi-ethnic, multinational empires. It's also something that is explicitly pushed in the Atlantic Charter by the United States and Great Britain at the start of World War II. And so it's this idea that's been out there, but as a practical matter, it's really difficult. In fact, when Woodrow Wilson pitched this idea to his advisors, they said, oh, Woodrow, please don't do this. You don't know what a box of worms, or no, can of worms. We have cans of worms that we're opening up. Please don't do this. It's going to be really messy. And the fact of the matter is, it is really hard to get the borders of a state to line up with the borders of a population, because people don't live in neatly connected or contiguous units. They're all over the place, and they're mixed together, and they are settled in patterns that maybe follow rivers or fertile valleys, but don't necessarily make for coherent, defensible borders. And there's no real way to disentangle people without incredible pain and incredible suffering and upheaval. And there's no way to necessarily make sure that your borders are going to get everybody from your group within, and to make sure that and to respond to or deal with groups that are maybe inside your nation state that aren't part of that nation. And so one of the big questions that states have had to wrestle with is to figure out how to deal with that disconnect between this ideal of a nation state that many states have or aspire to, and the reality on the ground. And so one option is the idea of assimilation, right? You structure your national identity in a way where people can become a member of that community and be recognized as a member of that community and be accepted as a member of that community. And then the community accommodates and adjusts to this new membership, right? So we have this idea of assimilation, and some states do this pretty well. The United States historically has done this quite well. Other states that historically have done pretty well with this have been France. Historically, France has framed French national identity not on being European or being Catholic or not Catholic, but instead on speaking the French language and speaking it well. And so if you could speak the French language, you could be French, and you could be part of that French national political community. Another option is violence. We've seen countries throughout the last 100, 150 years that have responded to that disconnect between what we say our country is in terms of national identity and the groups that are here on the ground. States have responded with violence, with ethnic cleansing. I'll point to Turkey here for a second. After World War I, Turkey emerges from the ashes of the Ottoman Empire, and the officers that sort of build this new Turkish state say, okay, this is going to be a nation state. We're not going to do that multi-ethnic empire thing that the Ottoman Empire was trying to be. This state, this new country, this Turkey, is going to be for the Turks, and that's what it is. And if you are here, you're Turkish, except not everybody there was Turkish. And so early on, you get a genocide of an Armenian population. Something like 1.2 million Armenians get killed as part of this sort of wrestling with, this is our state for the Turks, and yet there are people here who don't fit and therefore create sort of an identity problem for the state. Similarly, the Kurds in the more mountainous eastern parts of Turkey have been through decades and decades of conflict and repression, in which the Turkish state has again sought to crush Kurdish identity as something that shouldn't exist within a state for Turks, limiting where Kurdish can be used, limiting the political mobilization of the Kurdish people, and the Kurds responding with campaigns of violence that have waxed and waned over the last 50, 60 years. So that's a common pattern as well, and we'll talk more about that in a subsequent lecture. And then finally, you can say, well, this whole idea of a nation state is maybe swell, and it would be nice if we could do that, but that's not the world we live in. It's not possible to get the borders to line up. And so we have to figure out how to make that work, right? We have to figure out how to have a multinational state. We have to have multiple groups that have a national identity that they're demanding or asking for political voice for their group, are going to share a single state and make that work. And so successful examples of that would be Canada, where you have the Quebecois, the sort of French-speaking Canadians, and you have the more Anglo-English-speaking Canadians, and they figured out how to make it work, right? They put French and English on the signs, and French is a language that's used in curriculum and taught in schools, and so there's sort of a sense of an equal sharing of the state and of a common identity and a common political system, while maintaining two different sort of national traditions. That can work. In fact, the vast majority of countries out there in the world are multinational states. Many of them make it work, and make it work for extended periods of time. Let me give you a quick example of this challenge that was faced by Woodrow Wilson as he was looking at the map of Europe at the end of World War I. And so this is a rough sketching of identity groups. It was developed by a Soviet cartographer in the 1960s based on ethno-linguistic communities, which we'll say roughly correlates with potential national identities. And you can look at this map and say, okay, I see a Scotland, I see sort of an England and Wales, France kind of makes sense, Spain kind of makes sense, oh, there's Italy, that works, Germany's there, I see the Poland, and then you get into Southeastern Europe and things start looking a little messier, right? Where there's pockets and lines that are squiggly and difficult to disentangle. And so you get Wilson saying, okay, we'll just have this thing called Yugoslavia, land of the Southern Slavs, and we'll put all these different groups together, and hopefully they'll figure out how to work that out. And we'll create this this country called Czechoslovakia, where we'll put the Czechs and the Slovaks and we'll mash them together and make a country. So it's messy, and it was messy in Europe. This is Southeast Asia. The idea that you're going to be able to carve out a single country for each potential identity community is manifestly impractical. And so figuring out how to make it work where you have different people sharing a state and working together is absolutely essential for stable, coherent political systems. One last thing I'd say here is that there is, from an international relations perspective, a reason why states might want to either create a nation state or foster a national identity, right? That you could potentially build up a national shared common identity. And part of that is that in the modern era, warfare is closely linked to nationalism. And we see this in a couple different ways. We see it in the Napoleonic Wars, where when the French Revolution had been sort of killing off the nobility of France, and there's an invasion coming in from the Austrian Habsburgs, one of the most powerful forces on the European continent. It sparks this mobilization among the French people around this idea of, we are French, we are fighting for our country, and they rise up and throw the Habsburgs out and then go on a conquest of basically the whole of Europe, because people fighting for their country, for their identity group, is really powerful. People will make sacrifices in terms of taxes, they will make sacrifices in terms of conscription, they will endure hardship, they will fight longer. National identity is a powerful tool for mobilizing military force, which creates all sorts of really difficult questions, right? Because when armies were comprised of mercenaries, it was fairly easy to say, well, it makes sense to distinguish between combatants and civilians. But in the modern era, where entire nation states mobilize for war, and you can have the civilian population being the backbone of the state's ability to conduct war, that raises difficult questions. And in total wars like World War II, the civilian population, the national identity of the national foundation of a country, was targeted as part of the war effort. One of the other ways that the rise of national identity has really changed the dynamics of war in the modern era is that it's made conquest almost impossible, because people resist the idea of outsiders ruling over them, of outsiders controlling a political system. People push back, and they push back hard in ways that make it very difficult to take territory. In fact, I would say there are virtually no large-scale examples of conquest across national borders. And thinking back since the end of World War II, I can think of only a handful of examples where territory was taken and held. There's the conquest of Tibet. Chunk of Kashmir was taken by Pakistan in the independence of India and Pakistan. Russia takes Crimea a few years back, although it's telling that they took a part of Ukraine that was ethnically Russian, in large part, where there was a strong base of support for Russia rather than a strong base of support for Ukraine. Israel takes the West Bank and Gaza Strip. That would be another example, and I think is also a telling example of the problems that arise when you try to take territory and rule over another national group. That people use national identity to resist and to push back and say, I don't want to be a part of this empire. I want my own political voice.